At my granddaughter's graduation party, my son-in-law picked up the wooden recipe box I'd spent 3 months restoring and refinishing, turned it over once in his hands, and set it on the giveaway table by the door. "We're doing a minimalist thing with the kitchen," he said to my daughter, loud enough for the room to hear. "Vintage clutter doesn't really fit the aesthetic." My daughter laughed, not a real laugh, the performed kind, and said, "Sorry, Mom, you know how he is." I didn't argue. I walked over, picked up the box, tucked it under my arm, and said I'd forgotten there was something inside it I needed to get first. It was true. What was inside it was the reason I'd refinished it in the first place. I found my coat and I drove home. 2 hours later, my daughter called me, and her voice was a sound I hadn't heard from her since she was 12 years old and had broken something she couldn't fix. "Mom," she said, "what was in that box?" I sat down at my kitchen table. I set the box in front of me, and I put both hands flat on the lid, the way you put your hands on something you need to stay calm about. "Why do you ask, sweetheart?" I said, and I'll tell you what she said and what I said back and what happened in the weeks that followed. But first, let me tell you about the box, and about your grandfather, because you cannot understand any of this without understanding him first. My husband Norbert passed 14 months before that party, 51 years of marriage. He was a quiet man, in the way that rivers are quiet, all the movement happening underneath, where you couldn't see it unless you knew how to look. He drove a pickup truck that was 12 years old when he finally let me talk him into a new one. He wore the same canvas jacket from October through March for the last 2 decades of his life, and he patched the elbows himself with a kit I bought him at the hardware store because he said the patches I sewed were too fancy. I say this so you understand what kind of man he was. Not a flashy man, not a man who said much, but a man whose hands were always doing something for someone who didn't know he was doing it. We met in 1973 at a church potluck dinner in Medford, Oregon. I brought a green bean casserole. He brought nothing but himself and ate 4 helpings and asked who made the casserole. That's who Norbert was. Direct, unpretentious, completely unafraid of looking like he wanted something. We had 2 children, our son Aaron, who lives in Phoenix and calls me every Sunday without fail, and our daughter Shelby, who married a man named Trent about 8 years ago and moved to Portland, and who I have watched become someone I sometimes don't recognize. That's the part of this story that still aches. Not Trent, exactly. Trent is the kind of man he is because someone taught him to be that way, and I try to remember that even when it's hard. But Shelby, my Shelby, who used to sit at the kitchen table and watch me cook and ask me questions I didn't know how to answer, who carried a worn copy of her grandmother's handwritten stuffed pepper recipe in her wallet through high school, who cried at Norbert's funeral until she couldn't stand up straight. Somewhere in the last few years, Shelby started measuring things the way Trent's family measures them. By how they look, by whether they fit the right kind of picture, by whether they belong in the aesthetic, which is a word I never heard anyone use as a noun until Trent started using it. Their apartment has been photographed for 2 different home design blogs. Everything in it is either brand new or carefully chosen vintage, which apparently is different from regular old, and I have never been able to figure out exactly how. The recipe box doesn't look like carefully chosen vintage. It looks like what it is, which is a wooden box my grandmother brought from West Virginia in 1951, when she came to Oregon to be near her daughter. It's small, cedar, with a little brass latch. The paint on the outside, pale yellow with hand-stenciled blue flowers, has worn down to the bare wood in the corners, where hands have opened and closed it for 70 years. Inside it holds 312 recipe cards, some handwritten in my grandmother's cursive, some in my mother's, some in mine, some cut from magazines and newspapers going back to 1958. It also holds something else, something that wasn't there until 14 months ago. Norbert gave me that box the night before he died. I didn't know it was the night before he died. He'd been in and out of the hospital for 6 months, and there had been many nights I thought might be the last one, and this one didn't feel different to me until it was over. He asked me to bring the box to his room. He'd had it down from the shelf in the pantry, he said, when he was feeling well enough to stand, a few weeks before. He wanted to put something in it. He had me hold the box in my lap while he talked. His voice was thin. It had been thin for a long time. But his eyes were the same eyes they'd always been, steady and dark, and not particularly interested in anything except whatever they were looking at. "There's some paperwork in there now, Dottie," he said. He always called me Dottie. "My name is Dorothy, but nobody except Norbert ever called me anything but Dot, and nobody but Norbert called me Dottie, and now nobody does." "What kind of paperwork?" I asked. "The important kind," he said. He smiled. "The bottom of the stack, under the 1987 Church Ladies' Cookbook." I didn't look that night. He asked me not to. He said he wanted me to find it when I was ready, not when I was scared. I found it 3 weeks after he was gone, on a Sunday afternoon when Aaron had gone back to Phoenix, and the house was very quiet. I lifted out the 1987 Church Ladies' Cookbook, and underneath it, in a plain manila envelope in Norbert's handwriting, was a note that said, "For Dorothy. You'll know what to do with all of it." Inside the envelope were 2 things. The first was a folded document that I had to read 3 times before I believed what it said. Norbert had, over the course of 22 years, made a series of small investments, not impressive ones. Not the kind that make you rich fast. The kind a man like Norbert would make: slow, boring, undramatic, unmentioned. Index funds. A few individual stocks he'd researched at the library and then researched again. Contributions to accounts I knew existed, but whose balances I had stopped checking because Norbert handled those things, and I trusted him. The document was a summary from our financial advisor, a woman named Connie who'd worked with us for 15 years, showing the total current value. I will tell you what it said in a moment. I want you to understand first that Norbert never once told me the amount was growing the way it was. He never talked about money the way some men do, the way they need you to know what they're worth. He just let it sit. He let time do the work. 51 years of a man who bought store-brand cereal and repaired his own screen doors, and I had no idea. The total was $412,000. I sat on the kitchen floor for a while after I read that. Not from shock, exactly. From something that felt more like grief and gratitude at the same time, which is a combination I have come to know well in the 14 months since. The second thing in the envelope was a letter. Norbert's handwriting, 2 pages. The letters careful and slow the way his handwriting got in his last years, when his hands bothered him. He wasn't a man who wrote letters. He was a man who said things directly or didn't say them. So the fact of 2 pages of his handwriting meant something before I even read them. He wrote about the family, about Aaron and about Shelby, and about the grandchildren he hoped were coming. He wrote about what he wanted for them. He wrote about what he hoped I would do with the money. There was a paragraph about that, clear and specific, in the way Norbert was always clear and specific about the things that actually mattered to him. He wanted it to go to the grandchildren when they were grown. Split evenly, not to be given to their parents to manage, not to be handed over all at once, to be held until each grandchild reached 25 and then given to them directly. He'd already talked to Connie about how to structure it. The work was mostly done. He wrote, at the bottom of the second page, something I have read so many times since that I could write it in the dark. The box is the oldest thing in this house except for us, and we got it from the oldest women any of us will ever know. When you give this to our grandchildren someday, give it to them in the box. Let them find it in there the way you found it. Let them open it themselves. I want them to understand from the beginning that the most important things don't always look like the most important things. You know that. I need them to learn it too. I refolded the letter and put it back in the envelope. I put the envelope back under the 1987 Church Ladies' Cookbook. I put the box on the pantry shelf where it had lived for 40 years. And I started thinking about what came next. Shelby's daughter, our granddaughter Waverly, graduated from high school that June. She's a bright, funny girl with her grandfather's serious eyes and her mother's quick laugh, and watching her walk across that stage in the gymnasium of Jefferson High in Portland was one of the best moments of the 14 hardest months of my life. Norbert would have hollered, embarrassingly loud. I hollered for both of us. The party was at Trent and Shelby's house. A real house now, not an apartment. They'd bought it 2 years earlier, and it is the kind of house that gets described as thoughtfully curated. Everything in it has a reason for being where it is. There are no piles. There are no comfortable, mismatched things. The kitchen has open shelving where the dishes are arranged by color, and I have never once seen a box of crackers or a half-empty jar of peanut butter on any of those shelves, which tells you something about who lives there and how. I brought the recipe box to give to Waverly. I'd spent 3 months getting it ready. I'd cleaned it, oiled the cedar, touched up the brass latch, gone through every single recipe card to remove the ones that had become illegible and copy them out fresh in my own hand so they would last another generation. I'd organized the cards by category and typed a little index that I tucked inside the lid. And in the bottom, under the 1987 Church Ladies Cookbook, was the manila envelope with Norbert's letter and the paperwork from Connie showing the trust we'd established in Waverly's name and in the names of whatever other grandchildren might come. I hadn't told Shelby what was inside the envelope. I'd thought about it. I'd gone back and forth. But Norbert's instruction had been clear. Let them find it in there the way you found it. He wanted Waverly to open it herself. He wanted the discovery to belong to her. That was my only mistake. Or rather, it was the one thing I would do differently, knowing what I know now. Not because it was wrong to honor what Norbert asked, but because I had never accounted for the possibility that the box wouldn't make it to Waverly's hands. The party was full of Trent's people. His parents, his 2 brothers, friends I'd met at the wedding, and not since. Aaron had come up from Phoenix, which meant everything. Waverly's friends were there, loud and gorgeous in the way teenagers are at the beginning of summer, with all of it still ahead of them. I brought the box in a paper grocery bag because I hadn't known what else to put it in, and I set it on the gift table in the living room. Trent's mother, whose name is Deborah and who has never once looked at me the way you look at someone you consider an equal, saw me set it down and leaned over to read the little gift tag I'd made. She said something to Trent that I didn't catch. He glanced over, nodded, and looked away. An hour into the party, while I was in the kitchen helping Shelby put out more food, I heard Trent say something in the living room about clearing off the gift table to make room for the cake. I didn't think anything of it. I had my hands full. When I came back out, the gift table had been rearranged. A few wrapped boxes had been moved to the coffee table. The paper grocery bag with the recipe box was on a folding table near the front door, along with some other things. A stack of paper plates, a bag of ice that hadn't made it to the cooler, someone's forgotten jacket, the giveaway table. I recognized it because Trent does this. I'd seen it at their holiday parties. A polite way of making certain things disappear. I crossed the room without saying a word. I lifted the bag. Trent appeared beside me. "Oh, were you putting something there?" he said. He said it pleasantly, which is how Trent says most things that aren't pleasant at all. "We're keeping the main space clear. It's a little tight in here tonight." He smiled. "Vintage stuff though, right? Waverly's not really a sentimental object kind of girl, I don't think. We've been working on keeping the house streamlined." He gestured vaguely. "Maybe something she could actually use would be a better fit next time." I looked at him. He looked back at me with his pleasant expression, the one that says he's already moved on to the next thought. "I'll just take this home then," I said. I realized there's something in it I need to get first, and I picked up the bag, and I found Aaron, and I said goodbye to Waverly, and I told Shelby I was tired, which was true, just not for the reasons she assumed. I walked out of their thoughtfully curated house with the oldest thing I owned under my arm, and I sat in my car in their driveway for a few minutes before I could drive. I didn't cry there. I waited until I was on the highway, which was long enough to feel the full weight of what had just happened. Not the indignity of it, exactly, but the nearness. How close the whole thing had come to being lost. Not just the money, though $400,000 is not a small thing. Norbert's letter, his handwriting. 2 pages of words from a man who didn't write words down easily. A 17-year-old girl had almost never known. Her grandfather had been thinking about her since before she was born. I'd kept the box. But I hadn't kept it on purpose. That was the thought that sat with me the whole drive home. By the time I pulled into my driveway, I had stopped crying and started thinking, the way I do when the emotion clears and the practical part of my brain comes back online. Norbert used to say I was the most practical woman he'd ever met. He meant it as a compliment, and I took it as one. What Trent had done wasn't illegal. He hadn't thrown the box away. He'd moved it to an inconvenient table and made a comment about streamlining. But in doing so, he'd come within 1 hour of Waverly, never knowing what was inside it. And I had to ask myself whether the right move was to bring the box back and try again and hope the next time went differently. The answer was no. Connie and I had already done most of the legal work. The trust was established. The accounts were structured. All that needed to happen was the formal transfer of the documents, which Connie was holding, and a conversation with Waverly, a real one, not a party with 40 people and a cake. I was going to have that conversation. But not yet. Not until I understood what the household I was about to hand an inheritance into actually valued. I was on my second cup of tea when Aaron called. "Mom." His voice was careful, the way it gets when he's managing something. "Shelby just called me. She said, you left early, she's upset." "I know," I said. "She said Trent moved some stuff around for the cake and that you took something home." "She doesn't know what?" "No," I said. "She doesn't." There was a pause. Aaron, bless him, has always known when not to push. "Are you okay?" "I'm fine, sweetheart. I have everything I need." "Tell me about your flight back." He told me. We talked for 40 minutes and I let him think everything was all right, because for me in that moment it mostly was. I had the box. I had the letter. I had time. That night I opened the box and I reread Norbert's letter. All of it. I do this sometimes, late at night when the house is quiet, because his voice comes through in the writing in a way that nothing else does. He wrote the way he spoke, plainly, without decoration, directly at the thing he meant. In 51 years of marriage, I never had to wonder what Norbert meant. I let them find it in there the way you found it. Let them open it themselves. He'd meant Waverly. He'd pictured a quiet moment, a gift, a box opened with curious hands. What he hadn't pictured was a giveaway table. But here's the thing about Norbert that I keep coming back to. He thought in the long run. He thought in decades, the way people who've waited for things learn to think. He didn't panic. He made his moves quietly and let time prove whether he'd been right. 51 years of a man who never once, not once, raised his voice in a fight. If he were here, he'd tell me to wait. He'd tell me I'd know when the moment was right. I waited. 6 weeks after the graduation party, Shelby came to visit. Alone, which was unusual. She sat in my kitchen and drank coffee and was quiet for longer than I expected. And then she said, "Mom, what was in the bag you took home from the party?" I looked at her across the kitchen table. She was 41 years old, still beautiful, with shadows under her eyes that I recognized from the months after Norbert died, and I understood she hadn't been sleeping well. "What made you think about that?" I asked. She wrapped both hands around her mug. "I was going through some of Daddy's things," she said. "I still have a box of his stuff from when we cleaned out the house, and I've been avoiding it. I finally opened it last week." She stopped. Her chin did the thing it does, the thing it's done since she was small, when she's about to cry and trying not to. "He wrote me a note," she said. "It was in the box. Just a little one. On a piece of notebook paper. It said he'd left something for the grandchildren in Grandma's recipe box, with Mom, and that someday, when I gave it to my kids, I should make sure they opened it themselves." I closed my eyes for just a second. "He told me too," I said. She looked up. "What was in it?" And I told her. I got up and I brought the box from the pantry shelf and I sat back down and I told her about the investments and the trust and Connie and the accounts. I watched her face go through several things at once. I named the amount, and then I watched her face go through several more things. "Mom," she said, "that was in the box." "It was in the box," I said. The silence stretched out. I waited. "Sometimes that's what you do." "Trent moved it to the table by the door," she said quietly. Not a question. "He did. He said it was vintage clutter." Her voice was flat in a way that I recognized. Not the performed flatness Trent sometimes uses, the real kind. The kind that means something is settling. He didn't know. He didn't know what was in it, I said. But he made a decision about what it was worth without asking. That's the part I want you to sit with. She sat with it. I let her. When she finally spoke, her voice was different, quieter and also somehow more her. The Shelby I recognized from before the thoughtfully curated house. "Is the money gone?" she asked. "I mean, is it still?" "It's in trust," I said. "Safely. Connie has the paperwork. It's in Waverly's name and in the names of any grandchildren who come after. It cannot be touched by anyone except the grandchildren themselves when each of them turns 25. She absorbed that. "Not by Trent. Not by anyone." She nodded slowly. She looked at the box on the table. Her fingers reached out and touched the edge of it, the worn corner where 70 years of hands had worn the paint down. "Can I see the letter?" she asked. "Waverly gets the letter," I said. "That's whose it is. But I'll tell you what your father wrote to you, because he wrote you one too. You just haven't found it yet." She looked at me. "Go back to the box," I said. "The one you've been avoiding. Your father put a note for you in, with his things on purpose. The only reason to put something in a place you know someone will eventually look is because you wanted them to find it." She cried then, finally, in the way she'd been not crying since she sat down. I went around the table and stood behind her chair, with my hand on her shoulder, the way I did when she was small. Sometimes the job doesn't change. You just get older doing it. When she could talk again, she said, "I've let him change how I see things, haven't I?" I didn't answer right away. Some things a person needs to say themselves first. "I look at stuff now and I think about whether it fits," she said. "Whether it photographs, whether it's the right kind of thing. And I didn't used to be like that." She wiped her face with the back of her hand. "I almost let him give away Grandma's recipe box because it didn't fit the kitchen." "You almost let that happen," I said. "But I have the box, and Waverly is going to get what her grandfather saved for her. Nothing that matters was lost." She was quiet for a moment. "What do you want to do?" "I want to give Waverly her grandfather's gift properly," I said, "in a room where she can understand what she's holding. Not at a party. Not while someone's worried about where to put the cake. I want her to be able to ask questions and hear answers and know who saved this for her and why." Shelby was quiet for a moment. "Trent won't like being left out." "Trent can be in the room," I said. "In fact, I'd prefer it. Some things are better learned with witnesses." We set a date for the following Sunday. Shelby told Trent there was a family financial matter to discuss. She did not tell him what it was. She told me later that he assumed it was something difficult. Estate paperwork, maybe, something tedious, and had agreed without much interest. He was not prepared for what actually happened. I made a pot roast, because I have found over the years that the combination of a home-cooked meal and a difficult conversation is almost always more effective than either one alone. I set the table in the dining room. I put the recipe box in the center, washed and oiled and latched. Waverly's eyes went to it the moment she walked in, curious and uncertain. The way young people look at old things they know are significant without knowing why. We ate. "First," I insisted. "Norbert always said you don't handle serious things on an empty stomach, and he was right about most things." Then I cleared the plates and I sat back down and I put my hand on the recipe box. "Waverly," I said. "Your grandfather asked me to give you this. He left instructions about when and how. He wanted you to open it yourself at the right time, in a room full of people who loved you. I'm going to ask you to do that now." She looked at her mother. Shelby nodded. Waverly reached across the table and unlatched the box. I watched her lift the lid. I watched her look at the cards, the old handwriting, the organized tabs. She touched the edge of a card in my grandmother's cursive and looked up at me. "Keep going," I said. "All the way to the bottom." She lifted the cards out carefully, stacking them to the side, found the 1987 Church Ladies' Cookbook. Looked at me again. I nodded. She lifted it out. The manila envelope was underneath. She opened it the way you open something you already understand is important. Carefully. She unfolded the financial summary first and read it in silence. I watched her face. I watched her try to make sense of numbers that don't look like what they are until you look at them twice. "Grandma," she said slowly. What does this mean?" "Your grandfather invested money for you," I said. "For 22 years, before you were born and after. It's in trust in your name. When you're 25, it's yours to use for your education, your start in life, whatever you need. It cannot be spent or touched by anyone else. Not your parents. Not me." Trent's head came up across the table. "The trust is administered independently," I said, looking at him calmly. "Your grandfather was specific about that, and we honored what he asked." Trent's jaw was doing something controlled. "How much is it?" I looked at Waverly. "You should tell them. It's your money." She looked at the paper. "It says $412,000. The room went quiet. Aaron, who was there, I'd asked him to fly in, and he had, without asking why, leaned back in his chair with an expression I recognized as the one he wears when he is working very hard not to react. Trent said, after a moment, "We could have been consulted on the structure of this." "You could have," I said. "But Norbert made those decisions before he died, and I honored them as he asked. The structure is what it is." "Still," he said, "it seems like a decision that affects our family." "It is a decision that affects Waverly," I said. "Who is her own family? The trust is in her name. It will be there when she's 25. I'm sure you understand that the goal was for the money to be used for her future, not to flow through another household first." I said it gently. I said everything that night gently, but I said it. Trent's face had the look of a man who is recalculating. I'd seen that face at the party when he'd moved the bag to the table by the door and made his comment about vintage clutter. The face of a man doing social math, figuring out where things fit and where they don't. He was doing math now, and the numbers were not coming out the way he'd expected. I turned to Waverly. "There's one more thing," I said. "The most important thing." I reached into my cardigan pocket. I had put the letter there before they arrived, because I'd wanted to be sure I didn't forget it in the clearing of the plates. "Your grandfather wrote this for you," I said. "He asked me to read the first part aloud when the whole family found out about the gift. He didn't know what that moment would look like. But he said he wanted the words spoken out loud, not just read on paper alone." I unfolded the letter. My hands did not shake, but they wanted to. I read, "If you're reading this, or hearing it, then Grandma Dorothy did what I asked her to do, which means you found the box and you're sitting somewhere with the people who love you. That's all I ever wanted for you. I started saving this money the year your mother was in high school, because my grandfather did the same for me when I was young, and I never forgot it. Not the money. What the money meant. It meant someone was thinking about me before I needed anything. It meant I came from people who thought ahead. I want you to know that, too. Spend it on something that lasts. Get an education. Take a chance on yourself. And whatever you do, Waverly, please be the kind of person who can tell the difference between what something costs and what it's worth. That is the only thing I'm asking. I love you. I'm sorry I didn't make it long enough to say that out loud. Grandpa Norbert." I folded the letter. Aaron had his hand over his eyes. Shelby was crying openly and not trying to stop. Even Waverly, who is 17 and in the habit of pretending not to feel things in front of adults, was not pretending. Trent was looking at the table. I gave it a moment. The room needed to breathe. Then I said, "There's one more thing I want to address, since everyone's here." I looked at Trent. He looked back at me, and for the first time since I'd known him, he didn't look comfortable. "At Waverly's party," I said, "you moved this box to a table by the door and called it vintage clutter. You didn't know what was inside it. I want to believe that, and I do. But what I want you to think about is the decision you made before you knew. You looked at something old and handmade, and without a brand name, and you decided without asking that it didn't belong. You almost made that decision permanent. The only reason you didn't is because I happened to see it happen and walked over and picked it up." He opened his mouth. I kept going, gently. "I'm not telling you this to embarrass you. I'm telling you because that box has been in this family for 70 years, and it held the most important document I own, and it almost went home with nobody because it didn't fit the kitchen. And Waverly was almost going to grow up not knowing that her grandfather had been thinking about her since before she existed." I folded my hands on the table. That is worth saying out loud. So I'm saying it. Trent was quiet. The recalculating expression was gone. In its place was something I hadn't seen on him before, which was the look of a man who has been measured accurately and found the experience uncomfortable. Not a bad man, but a man who has been very comfortable measuring everything else. "I'm sorry," he said. It was a small sentence, but it was real. I could tell it was real because he didn't immediately follow it with an explanation. "I know," I said, and I meant it. I looked at Waverly. "The box comes home with me again tonight. It's not safe yet in a house that doesn't know what it's holding. When I see that it's understood, and I think I will see that, because you are your grandfather's granddaughter and you have his eyes, then it's yours, along with everything inside it." She nodded. She looked at the box, the worn yellow paint, the blue flowers gone soft with age, and I watched her actually see it for what it was, maybe for the first time. "The recipes are in there too," I said. 312 of them. Some of them are in handwriting from women who have been gone for 50 years. Learn to cook from them. That's also an inheritance." She almost smiled at that. It was the right almost smile. In the months since, things have shifted in the ways that matter. Waverly started texting me on Sunday afternoons, asking about this recipe or that one. Last month, she came to visit for a weekend, and we made her great-great-grandmother's apple cake together. And she stood at the counter measuring flour the way I'd stood there 40 years ago, and I thought of Norbert so hard it was almost like having him in the room. Shelby went back to the box Aaron was talking about, the one with Norbert's things, and she found what her father had left for her. I don't know exactly what it said. She hasn't told me, and I haven't asked, because some things are private even between a mother and her daughter. But I know she cried for a long time, and I know she called Aaron after, and I know that whatever was in that note, she's been different since she read it. Not transformed. I'm not going to tell you. Shelby became a different person overnight, because people don't work that way, and stories that say they do are not telling the truth. But the Sunday after she read it, she came to my house, and we sat in the kitchen, and she asked me to teach her to make her grandmother's stuffed peppers, and she wrote down the recipe in her own handwriting in a little notebook she brought with her. She said she was starting a recipe notebook. "Trent will think it's clutter," she said, and she was smiling when she said it. "Maybe," I said, "but it's your kitchen too." She laughed. It was the real one. Trent and I are careful with each other, the way two people are when they've been honest, and neither one of them has fully recovered from it yet. He's not a bad man. He is a man who was taught a particular way of seeing and is learning, slowly, that it was incomplete. That's hard work. I know because I've watched people do it. I've done some version of it myself. The trust is growing. Connie manages it and sends me updates quarterly, and every time I look at the numbers I think of Norbert, buying store-brand cereal and patching his own elbows and letting time do the work, and I understand all over again what kind of man he was. The recipe box is still on my pantry shelf. Waverly asked for it once, early on. I told her not yet, and she accepted that without argument, which told me something good about her. I'll know when it's time. The box is patient. It's been patient for 70 years, and it can wait a little longer. Some mornings I make my coffee, and I open the box, and I read a recipe card in someone's old handwriting, and I think about all the hands that have opened this latch, all the women who stood in kitchens and fed people and were never once photographed doing it. And I feel the full weight of what ordinary things carry when you know how to look at them. Norbert knew. He always knew. There's no brand on 22 years of a man buying index funds for a grandchild who didn't exist yet. There's no aesthetic for a 2-page letter written in careful handwriting by someone whose hands hurt. There's no label on a cedar box with worn corners that holds everything a family knows about how to nourish itself. But if you are very lucky, and if you are paying attention, you will understand what you are holding before someone has to tell you. That is the only thing I'm asking. For my grandchildren, for my daughter, for anyone who has ever held something ordinary and underestimated it. Learn how to look.